Now, African civil society organizations have petitioned presidents across the continent to increase domestic funding of education as they prepare for next week's Global Education Summit in London. Global education financing benchmarks require that 5% of GDP and a minimum of 20% of national budgets are committed to education. But Ghana allocated just 13.6 billion Ghana cedis last year, which represents 16% of the total national budget. The coalition led by Africa Education Watch wants President Akufo-Addo and his counterparts across the continent to commit to increased allocations to the sector. Let's take a look at the project petition as you have on your screen, and it reads, as you are no doubt aware, the Global Education Summit's financing GPE 2021 to 2025, co-hosted by UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya, will take place on the 28th and 29th of July 2021. A key moment for the global community to come together and support quality education for all children. This event will see critical decisions being made regarding the financing of education worldwide. Let's go to some of the recommendations. It says that we would like, and this is a call to the minister, it says that we would like you to liaise with the President Akufo-Addo to ensure the endorsement of the political statements by the government of Ghana as soon as possible to show Ghana's commitments to addressing the issues outlined in the statement. Also, make ambitious and measurable commitments to education financing at the Global Education Summit. These may include committing to safeguarding education expenditure to pre-COVID levels, increasing domestic financing of education towards the 20% global benchmark and beyond, establish and implement policies to ensure that no child is left behind, ensure the efficient and equitable use of resources, and a number of others. It's also said it's critical that education is prioritized in public expenditure, enabled by the freed up funds and new liquidity from debt relief initiatives and the new allocation of special drawing rights when secured. Also, commits to actions aimed at increasing domestic tax revenues in progressive ways. That's the broad points there. Let's speak a bit further with the Executive Director for Africa Education Watch, Kofi Asare, for more on this. Mr. Asare, you just presented this petition to the President. What exactly is prompting this push for increased local funding?
Well, good afternoon, good afternoon to your cherished audience. If you study the trajectory, you realize that between 2010 and 2012, we reached 30% national budgetary allocation to education sector. And we're doing about 6% of GDP. Since 2012, the contribution of the national budget to education and of GDP to education has been on a decline. To the extent that as we speak, we are doing only 14% per the 2021 budget. We acknowledge that there are challenges due to COVID, and that is why this summit is very important, because the Global Partnership for Education is rallying world leaders to commit to at least maintaining education financial level at pre-COVID levels, so that the increasing number of out-of-school children are not left to wallow, but rather have an opportunity to re-enter and complete school. Don't forget that in Ghana, about 400,000 children of primary school going age are still not in school due to, among others, lack of funds. And so that is why this this summit is important. And for that matter, our call onto the President and the Minister of Education to commit up to 20% of the national budget and 5% of GDP to education is very, very necessary.
Now, Ms. Asare, it's interesting you mentioned this because with the introduction of free SHS, the government will argue that the commitment of this administration to education has increased over the years.
Well, that's the matrix. You know, that's the issue many people don't get. Even though there has been a nominal increase in the quantum of money invested in education, even though we are committing 15 billion cedis this year, compared to, let's say, 9 or 8 billion cedis in 2012, okay? The percentage of the national budget expenditure or allocation going into education is reducing. Don't forget that the economy is expanding. GDP has more than doubled over the past 10 years. And so you expect that in terms of the quantum, definitely the nominal value of funds allocated for education is going to increase. But percentage-wise, if GDP increases, it means that the percentage contribution to education by way of GDP and national budgets must be stable. It must still remain at least 20% for budgets and then at least 5% for GDP. All we are experiencing is that GDP has more than doubled, but contribution from national budget to education has reduced from 30% to less than half, about 14% in 2021. While that of the GDP has reduced from 6% in 2010 to about 4% presently. So until we are able to sustain the levels benchmarked by all countries, including governments, including Ghana government, to be the level that is required to sufficiently provide quality education for all, you will only have free senior high school benefiting from adequate resources, whilst TVETs and other aspects of our educational system, including basic education, will suffer because of the financing gap between what ought to be given to education and what is currently being received by the sector.
Now, Mr. Asare, we understand that you've acknowledged the COVID-19 pandemic, but we should also look beyond that to the financial sector crisis which Ghana faced, which cost us a lot of money. Before that, there was the energy crisis, which was before that preceded by the shortfall in oil prices. So it looks like our economy has withstood shock after shock after shock, which all goes to our national kitty. How can we afford this expenditure?
Exactly. The whole world is going through an austerity because of COVID. Revenue projections or revenue inflows has reduced, and government are resorting to loans and other ways of mobilizing cash domestically. It is agreed. But you see, in times of austerity, you may cut, but not cut within your social sectors, especially education and health, because the growth of all other sectors depend on the education sector. So what we are saying is that, yes, there have been cuts. Indeed, in the case of Ghana, we didn't even experience a cut. The amount allocated to education actually increased from 13.5 billion last year to 15.6 billion this year. So it is not actually a cut. But the point we are making is that cut on COVID or no COVID, we have been operating far below the benchmark 20% national budgetary allocation to education. And we have been operating also far below the benchmark of at least 5% to 6% GDP allocation to education. The continental average is 5%. The benchmark is 6%. We are at 4%. And so, with or without COVID, we have an obligation to appreciate the fact that the reason that you have 5,000 schools under trees, the reason why about 20% of your students are not able to complete junior high school, are among others due to the fact that there is inadequate infrastructure. Obviously, due to the fact that there is inadequate funding of education as projected. And so the only way you can ensure that there is an equitable access to education, quality of for that matter, is by providing the resources needed. If you look at our education strategic plan, in our own projection, this year, government projected that it will require in excess of 19 billion to finance education. The amount available is 15 billion. And so there's a financing gap of about 25%. All we are saying is that if we are able to meet the 20% national budget allocation to education benchmark, the 6% GDP to education benchmark, automatically would have been meeting our own projected revenue for funding the education strategic plan in 2021 and would have been closing the financing gap of 25%. That will ensure that every child in Ghana, irrespective of your gender, your socio-economic status, or your geographical location, will have access to a decent education at least at the primary level. That is why we need to recommit our leaders to financing education to the levels benchmarked to achieve the quality and remain within progress to achieving SDG 4 by 2030, in spite of COVID.
I'm just curious, Mr. Asare, about the fact that we've had countless conversations about the fact that the lion's share of our education budget, as does every other sector budget, goes into emoluments and compensations. Basically, we take most of the money we have to pay salaries. Will it change if we increase the budget? Shouldn't we rather be looking at the allocation of funding within the education sector, since so much of it goes to making payments and we don't get enough fiscal space to do infrastructure and to improve upon quality?
The personal emolument line, which accounts for salaries, is an inelastic line. It is a fixed budget that cannot be varied, because you can't decide to pay someone half of their salary because you don't have adequate resources. So how we need to appreciate the funding architecture within the sector is that immediately funds come in, there are some funds that are inelastic. And one of such budget lines includes the emolument or salary budget line. So if you add more and more resources, you may not be, or you will not be varying the budget lines for salary, because it's already inelastic and already fully funded. No one owes anyone salary. So it is only when you finance the budget properly or at optimum that you can free resources for the social investments, i.e. including infrastructure investments. If you look at this year's budget, if you go to CAPEX, where infrastructure is financed, there's very little there. It is true. But almost 100% of what is required under personal emolument has been accounted for, has been released. So any extra funding automatically will move into CAPEX and other areas of social investment required to expand access and ensure equity in the system. That is why we always presume that the financing gap is always shifted, the incidence of the financing gap is always to the detriment of social investment and infrastructure in the education sector, rather than the personal emolument, because we have never heard that no teacher worked and was never paid in this country before.
Thank you very much, Kofi Asare, for joining us. He's Executive Director for Africa Education Watch.